Tonight, I want you to imagine something very simple and very hard at the same time. You are about to fall asleep in a place where the walls are made of rough wood and mud, the roof leaks smoke instead of letting it out, and the only thing standing between you and the kind of cold that can kill a person in a few hours is a small fire, a pile of straw, and the warmth of other breathing bodies pressed close to yours. So before you settle in under your modern blanket and let this video play in the dark, take a second to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy these slow journeys into the past. And if you want, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you, because somewhere in that long chain of watchers and listeners, across countries and time zones and quiet bedrooms, there were once peasants who lay awake in the dark of a wooden hut, listening to the wind and the crackle of embers, trying to sleep their way through the coldest winters of the Middle Ages. Picture a winter evening somewhere in the 13th or 14th century, in a part of Europe that never makes it into the illuminated manuscripts or the heroic poems, where the great stone castles you know from movies are far away on distant hills, and the real work of keeping a kingdom alive happens in low wooden huts scattered along frozen fields, and where the daylight does not so much end as drain away into a deep blue gloom that creeps over the land like a slow tide. The sky has already turned the color of iron. The last smear of sunset has disappeared behind bare black trees, and the air is so sharp that every breath feels like tiny needles along the inside of your nose. Out beyond the village, streams are locked in ice, cart tracks have frozen solid into ruts, and every sound from a distant dog barking to a cartwheel creaking seems unnaturally clear in the cold, as if the air itself has become glass. Down a narrow, muddy lane, now crusted with frozen footprints, you walk toward a small cluster of huts, low and squatting, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight of old snow and the soot of 100 evenings' smoke, and as you get closer, you can see that nothing about this scene is romantic or picturesque. The walls are patched with daub and dung, gaps stuffed with straw that has turned black with age, the yard is churned with frozen mud, and there is the faint but unmistakable smell of animals, manure and wool and damp hay, all mixed with wood smoke that never quite clears. This is not the Middle Ages of tapestries and tournaments. This is the world of people who rise in darkness, work in cold and go to sleep, not to rest luxuriously, but to hide from the winter for a few hours at a time. If you pause for a moment at the edge of this little village and let yourself just listen, you will hear almost nothing. No traffic, no hum of electricity, no distant engines or radios. Only the slow, muffled sounds of a community folding itself into the night. A door banging once as someone brings a last armful of wood, a hen complaining as it is scooped up and carried indoors, the short, breathless laugh of a child being hurried inside by a tired mother, and over everything the steady sigh of the wind moving over frozen fields and pushing against thin wooden walls. It is in that quiet, on nights like these, that medieval peasants lay down to sleep, and the question of how they did it, how they arranged their beds, their bodies, their fires and their fears, becomes not a detail of history, but a way of understanding how very fragile and how very stubborn human beings can be. So if you are listening in bed, maybe with a cup of something warm nearby and a blanket pulled up to your chin, I invite you to walk with me in imagination down that frozen track, to push open the door of a single wooden hut, and to step into a room where an entire family, and sometimes their animals, are trying to squeeze a small island of warmth and sleep out of a hostile winter night. And as we move slowly around that cramped space together, I'll talk you through how medieval peasants really slept, what they lay on, who they shared it with, how they kept the cold away, and how their nights unfolded in long, smoky, half-lit hours that feel strangely familiar and utterly alien at the same time. You raise your hand to the rough wooden latch and push the door inward, and at once the cold air behind you is shoved aside by a different kind of discomfort, a wave of dense, smoky warmth that wraps around your face and makes your eyes sting. For a heartbeat, you see almost nothing, just a blur of orange light and moving shadows. And then, as your vision adjusts, the hut resolves itself into a single crowded room where an entire life, work, sleep, eating, birth, illness, and death has been squeezed into a space no bigger than a small modern bedroom. The ceiling is low enough that a tall person could brush it with an upstretched hand, blackened with soot from years of accumulated smoke, the rafters thick with spiderwebs and hanging bundles of dried herbs, and there is no chimney to carry the fumes away, only a vague dark patch in the thatch where smoke finds its slow, grudging path outside. Under your feet there is no wooden flooring, nothing smooth or polished, just hard, packed earth covered with a layer of straw that rustles and crunches as you move, the straw already stamped flat and darkened by countless feet, human and animal, and by the small daily disasters of spilled soup, mud, and ash. Somewhere very close by, a pig shifts its weight in the semi-darkness and gives a soft, grumpy grunt, a reminder that in these months, the boundary between barn and bedroom is more an idea than a wall. Beyond it, you can hear the slow, heavy breathing of a cow, her presence not just tolerated but welcomed, a thick, living furnace that exudes heat into the cold room. The smell is complex and not entirely pleasant. Smoke, damp wool, sweat, wet straw, animal breath, and the faint metallic tang of iron tools. But there is something comforting in it as well. This is the smell of survival, of bodies and fire, refusing to surrender to the season outside. At the center of it all is the hearth, a shallow hollow in the floor lined with rough stones, where a small fire burns low and steady rather than high and dramatic. Because every stick of wood is precious. The flame is not meant to dazzle, only to endure. A dark iron pot hangs over it from a crooked hook, its sides stained with years of use, and from it rises the thin, honest smell of barley or oat pottage, perhaps with a few bits of cabbage or onion, and on rare nights a shred of salted meat. This is supper, breakfast, and often lunch as well, a slow bubbling mixture that fills the stomach just enough to make sleep possible. Around the fire, arranged in a rough circle, the family sits, a man with shoulders rounded by work, a woman whose hands are never still, 3 children of different ages bundled in wool and linen, and in the far corner on a low pile of rags, an older woman whose face is furrowed like the bark of a tree. They glance up as you step in, though of course in this little story you are a ghost they cannot see, and then their attention returns to the small rituals of evening. The father slicing a crust of hard dark bread with a knife he sharpens himself, because replacing it would be impossible, the mother stirring the pot and occasionally blowing on a coal that seems about to die, the children shifting closer to the warmth as their bare toes curl in the straw, the grandmother murmuring a soft prayer under her breath that could just as easily be gratitude as worry. In their world, sleep is not something that simply happens at the end of the day. It is something that has to be prepared for, like a fragile plant, a thing protected and coaxed into being. The hut itself is part of that preparation. Its walls are made from timber daubed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung, a crude but surprisingly efficient insulation, and gaps are plugged with bundles of old cloth or moss, not to keep the cold out completely, that would be impossible, but to slow it, to blunt its teeth. If you look closely along the beams near the door, you might see small marks carved into the wood, little crosses or circles, or a star scratched with a knife. To later historians they look like simple doodles, but to the people who live here they are quiet weapons, witch marks or charms cut into the very bones of the hut to keep harm outside, whether that harm comes in the form of bad spirits, misfortune, or just the relentless, wearing cold. Above the hearth hang small bundles of dried plants, sage, thyme, maybe a sprig of rosemary, if the family is lucky, and perhaps a few leaves of something more bitter like wormwood. They will be crumbled into soup when someone is sick, or burned to sweeten the air, or tucked into bedding in the hope that their scent will chase away fleas and bad dreams. In the Middle Ages, People did not draw a hard line between medicine and magic, between practical knowledge and quiet faith. The same herb could be a remedy, a charm, and a sign of hope all at once. As the last of the pottage is scraped from the pot into rough wooden bowls so warm by fingers and spoons that they have become polished in patches, the family eats in a silence that is not awkward but economical, punctuated only by the sounds of chewing, the occasional clink of wood against iron, and a few soft words about the day that has just ended, and the tasks waiting tomorrow if the weather allows. Portions are carefully measured, a little more for the father who will spend tomorrow in the fields or repairing tools, a little more for the mother who will carry water, mend, spin, and cook, enough for the children to keep their energy up, and something small for the grandmother, who contributes now more with memory and prayer than with muscle. As they eat, you can see how much of their comfort, such as it is, comes not from the quality of the food or the softness of the room, but from the simple fact of not being alone in the dark. When the bowls are emptied and wiped clean with the last scraps of bread, the pot is lifted from the fire and set aside, and the hearth is tended like a sleeping child. The father and mother work together without needing to speak, nudging coals into a tighter cluster, laying a thicker piece of wood across the top, not to make a blaze, but to keep a steady, slowly feeding glow that can be coaxed back into flame in the morning. They know from bitter experience that if the fire dies completely, relighting it is not just a matter of striking a match. Kindling is scarce and never truly dry in these months, and if a neighbour is too far away or their fire has died as well, the night can grow dangerously cold before a new flame is born. So they bank the embers under a soft blanket of ash, dimming their light but preserving their heart, trusting that tucked away from the drafts they will survive until dawn. Only when the fire has been settled into this careful half-sleep does the family turn to their own bed, and here, perhaps, the scene becomes most distant from your own nightly routine, because there is no row of separate bedrooms waiting, no neat division into children's rooms and parents' rooms, no soft mattress with crisp sheets, no personal pillow fluffed just the way you like it. Instead, at one side of the room against the wall that seems least leaky, there is a low wooden frame stuffed with straw, or in poorer huts, simply a deep layer of straw spread directly on the floor, covered with a rough cloth to keep the worst of the chaff from scratching bare skin. Over it lie blankets that are not really blankets, as you know them, but heavy woolen cloths patched and repatched, stiff with old smoke and lanolin, the fat in the wool that helps it repel water and cling to warmth even when damp. The children, already drowsy from warm food and the hypnotic flicker of the fading fire, begin to wriggle out of the clothes they wear in the day and keep on through most of the night, because garments are few and precious, and washing them in winter is both difficult and dangerous. A shirt soaked and hung outside might freeze before it dries, and a body without that layer would feel the cold like a knife. Instead, layers are shifted rather than removed. Outer tunics and cloaks are folded to become makeshift pillows, under tunics stay on, and sometimes, on the hardest nights, even day shoes are kept by the bed so that they will not freeze too stiff to wear in the morning. One by one the family climbs onto the straw, each person automatically reaching for the place they always take, a habit so ingrained it is almost like the imprint of their bodies on the bed itself, and you can see, even before they settle, that sleep in this world is not an individual experience, but a shared arrangement, a weaving together of limbs and breath and warmth in the face of a cold that never truly gives up. And as they begin to lie down, the fire dimming behind them, the animals shifting in their own corners, the hut slowly rearranging itself from a place of work and eating into a place of sleep, we can move a little closer to their improvised mattress of straw and wool and see exactly how medieval peasants turned such rough materials into a bed that could carry them through the longest, hardest nights of winter. If you move a little closer to that low wooden frame pushed up against the wall, you can see that it is less a piece of furniture and more a clever compromise with the earth itself, a way of lifting bodies just high enough above the cold ground that the frost cannot quite sink its fingers straight into their bones. The mattress is nothing more than a large sack, a coarse linen tick stuffed with straw, hay, or whatever dry plant material the family could gather at the end of autumn, and if you press your hand down into it, the surface gives with a faint crunch, springs back unevenly, and reveals hidden lumps where stalks and stems have bunched together beneath the cloth. Over the weeks, that filling will slowly break down under the weight of sleeping bodies, turning from airy to compacted, from golden and fragrant to dark, dusty, and full of tiny broken pieces that scratch against skin. And yet for the people who lie here it is still a luxury, an enormous improvement over the simple layer of loose straw that their grandparents might remember from their own childhood nights. From the few records that survive wills and inventories where people listed their possessions at death, we know that straw mattresses were considered valuable enough to be mentioned alongside tools and clothing, and that they were regularly emptied and refilled as the seasons changed, the old filling burned or thrown out in the hope of taking some of the fleas and lice with it. You can imagine the small ritual of that cleaning, a warmer spring day when the sack is dragged outside, turned inside out, beaten with sticks, until the dust blooms in thick clouds, and then carefully stuffed again with fresher straw, and if the family can spare it, a handful of dried mint or lavender, their sharp scent briefly overpowering the smell of smoke and sweat. Tonight, though, in the deep of winter, there will be no such renewal. The straw you feel under your hand is the same that has been slept on for months, flattened and imprinted with the shapes of familiar bodies, carrying the faint, lingering perfume of summer fields under the heavier odor of wool and ash. The children are the first to scramble into this nest, not because they always get the best of things, but because they are small and quick, and their bodies slide easily into gaps where adults would feel the hard frame beneath them. They wriggle and twist, giggling softly until their mother's voice drops into a more serious murmur, and a hand on a shoulder reminds them that this is not a game but a nightly arrangement. They all depend on. The father follows, moving with the weary deliberation of someone whose muscles ache from work, and who knows exactly how little space he has. He eases himself down along the wall, taking the place closest to the fading warmth of the hearth, and the mother slots herself in beside him, making sure that at least one child is on each side, so that every small body can borrow heat from an adult. The grandmother is last, lowering herself carefully onto the edge where the straw is thinnest and the draft strongest, because age in this world often means not getting the warmest place, but accepting whatever is left once the younger ones are settled. Looking at them now, you can see that the idea of my bed in the way you understand it simply does not exist here. There is only our bed, a shared shifting heap of straw, cloth and flesh, where the boundaries between one person's space and another's are drawn, not with walls and doors, but with the angles of elbows and knees. The older children know instinctively how to tuck their legs so they fit without kicking anyone, how to curl in around the pig that has been allowed to sleep at the foot of the bed on truly bitter nights, how to twist the corner of a blanket in just the right way so that 3 people can feel covered by one piece of cloth. It is a choreography learned not from instruction but from countless evenings of trial and error, and as they settle now, you can watch it unfold in a series of small, practiced movements. A blanket stretched a little higher over a shivering shoulder, a child gently rolled further away from the damp patch in the wall, a rough woolen sleeve pulled down over bare wrists. The blankets themselves are stories woven into fabric, and if you run your fingers along their edges you would feel many lives layered there. Patches of differently dyed wool sewn over older holes, stray threads where someone once intended to mend again and never quite found the time, hardened spots where grease or tallow was used to rub a stain away. They are heavy, smelling strongly of sheep and smoke, and when the mother pulls one over the entire family it falls on them like a small roof, trapping the air that their bodies have already warmed. It is not the even, enveloping heat of modern bedding, but pockets of warmth and pockets of chill that slowly even out as their breathing synchronizes and the night deepens, a living microclimate that shifts with every sigh and small movement. Lying there among them in imagination, you might notice how the first sensation is not comfort, but closeness. The press of a child's foot against your shin, the weight of someone's arm across your ribs, the rough scrape of wool against your cheek, and beyond that the steady thud of heartbeats and the whisper of lungs. To a person used to solitude this might feel suffocating, but for these peasants it is the only true defense they have against the cold, and also, quietly, their main defense against fear, because the darkness that sits beyond the thin wooden walls is full not only of frost but of wolves, thieves, and the kind of nameless anxieties that grow larger in the long months when the sun is weak. Here, pressed together in a shared bed, they can feel with their own skin that they are not alone, and that knowledge seeps deeper than any blanket could. Scholars who study pre-industrial sleep talk about how people in these centuries often slipped into slumber in stages rather than all at once, their bodies slowly relaxing as the day's tasks are set aside, their minds drifting in and out of attention to the small noises around them. And you can sense that process beginning now in the hut. The father's breathing lengthens, becoming a slow, regular rise and fall. The youngest child, who had been fidgeting and whispering to himself, finally grows still, his fist unclenching around a scrap of cloth he has been clutching as a poor man's comfort toy. The grandmother's lips move with the last words of an evening prayer, and then fall still as her eyes slip closed. The mother is the last to surrender to sleep, lying awake for a little while longer with her gaze fixed on the faint glow of the buried embers, listening for any change in the sound of her children's breath that might signal a cough or a fever, her thoughts running ahead to tomorrow's chores, even as her body pleads for rest. Outside, the wind presses against the walls with a low, insistent hum, and every now and then a stronger gust pushes a little of that cold air through the cracks, slinking under the bed and around the sleeper's feet. But even that intrusion becomes part of the rhythm of the night, a reminder in the half-conscious mind that the winter is still there, still hungry, still held back only by a shell of wood, mud, wool, and shared warmth. You might think that such conditions would make sleep shallow and restless, yet the human body, especially one exhausted by physical labor, is remarkably good at finding rest in imperfection. Slowly, as the minutes drift past like flakes of falling snow, the little noises of adjustment grow rarer, and the hut settles into its own deep, uneven slumber. Partia 3. Sundhelle. Fumulshilinista nopsi medievale. As the room quiets, what you first take for silence begins to separate into layers, like threads in a woven cloth, each sound subtle on its own but together forming the soundscape of a medieval winter night. Closest to you is the faint crackle from the hearth, the occasional soft sigh of ash collapsing as the embers shift, a reminder that even banked and hidden the fire is still alive and working. From the corner where the cow lies curled on her folded legs comes the slow, heavy rhythm of her breathing, broken now and then by a soft rustling as she moves her jaw in some ruminant dream. Her breath rises in small warm clouds that the human sleepers cannot see in the dark, but which you can imagine moving gently across the room like invisible wafts of extra warmth. Somewhere at the edge of the straw mattress, the pig lets out an indignant snort in its sleep and rolls to a slightly better spot, making the straw sigh and crunch beneath its weight. One of the children murmurs a half-word in response, and then sinks again into deeper dreaming. Listen a little further out, beyond the animals and the bed, and you will catch the tiny feet of a mouse skittering along the wall, searching for a forgotten crumb near the wooden chest that holds the family's few valuables, its passage marked by the faintest of scrapings as it threads through the straw. In another setting, this might be a cause for outrage, but here it is simply one more small inhabitant sharing the hut's limited warmth. Only if it becomes too bold, raiding stored grain or chewing at clothing, will it move from tolerated nuisance to enemy. High above, almost out of awareness, the wind finds every weakness in the thatch and wooden planks, setting them to their own quiet music. A creak as the beams adjust to a change in pressure, a quiet groan where two boards rub against each other, the occasional soft thud as a small clump of snow slides down the roof and falls into the yard outside. Beyond the hut itself lies the village, wrapped tight under the same heavy darkness, and even though you cannot see it, you can hear its faint echoes if you pay attention. A dog barking twice and then falling silent as if reassured. The confused crow of a rooster who cannot decide whether the light in the sky is moon or morning. A short, distant burst of laughter from another hut where someone is still awake, maybe retelling a story to pass the long night. There are no clocks, no chiming church bells to mark every hour in most of these small communities, and so people learn the time by the feel of it, by the position of the stars when they step outside to relieve themselves, by the sense of how far the fire has burned down, by the way their bodies move through cycles of waking and sleep. Inside, under the low ceiling, the smoke from the hearth hangs like an invisible veil, thicker near the rafters where it curls and collects before slowly filtering through the thatch. You might expect it to be suffocating, and in truth it sometimes is. Eyes sting, throats grow rough, coughs are common, especially in children. Yet this acrid veil also does quiet work in the background, killing insects that would otherwise multiply in the straw and on the hanging cloth, drying meat that has been strung up just above head height for that very purpose, and coating the wood with a thin layer of soot that over years helps seal it against damp. The smell of it sinks into everything, hair, clothing, even skin, and if you could step outside your body and sniff the air of this hut from a distance, you might recognize that particular smoky odor centuries later if it somehow drifted into your world for a moment. Medieval people, living in such conditions, did not imagine that they were sleeping in filth or misery. Most of them had never known anything else, and their sense of comfort was calibrated to a different scale. A bed that did not leak too much cold from underneath, blankets that could just about be pulled over every shoulder, a fire that still glowed faintly under ash, and the reassuring weight of family and animals breathing in the dark. That combination could feel, in the context of their daily lives, like genuine safety. And when their minds floated toward dreams, they were guided not by the soft mechanical hum of distant traffic or the glow of streetlights against the window, but by these organic sounds and smells, the hiss of a sap-filled log, the shift of straw, the low murmur of a prayer whispered half asleep, the sweetness of dried herbs smouldering gently in the embers. After some hours of this deep shared rest, the night often does something you might find unusual. It bends and opens, releasing the sleepers into a brief liminal waking. Without alarms or obligations, bodies rise out of their first sleep naturally, pulled by an old rhythm that modern researchers have come to call segmented sleep, but which to these peasants is simply the way nights are. The father might wake first, his eyes sliding open to a darkness that is softer now, his ears tuned to the state of the fire and the breathing around him. Perhaps he feels the cold creeping back in from the edges of the bed, or perhaps a dream has let him go more gently than usual. He lies still for a moment, listening, then slowly eases himself free from the tangle of limbs, careful not to disturb the children, using his chest as a pillow. He pads across the straw in worn woolen socks, every step a small crunch, and kneels by the hearth to check the embers, his fingers moving with the kind of practiced care you only develop when a mistake could mean hours of extra hardship. Beneath the ash he finds the glow he hoped for, a bed of dull red coals, and with a piece of broken branch he coaxes them together, breathing gently until a flicker of flame appears again like an eye opening. That faint light throws long shadows over the sleeping shapes behind him, painting their faces with a soft orange wash. One of the children sighs and rolls over, the grandmother's hand twitches as if reaching for something in a dream. The mother opens her eyes halfway, and then relaxes when she recognizes the familiar routine. In this quiet interval between first and second sleep, time feels strange and elastic. It is not yet morning, not really night, but a kind of private pocket into which thoughts and whispered conversations can be tucked. Some medieval texts hint that people used these hours to pray, to reflect on their worries, to tell stories that there was no time for in the rush of daylight or the drowsy heaviness before bed. You can imagine the father sitting there beside the small rekindled flame, his legs drawn up, perhaps murmuring a few lines from the only prayer he knows by heart, not because he expects a thunderous answer, but because forming the words gives shape to the fear and hope he carries. Fear of crop failure, of illness, of taxes he cannot pay, hope for a milder spring, for a child's lingering cough to fade, for enough food to last until the thaw. Sometimes in such hours the mother might join him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and sitting with her back against the bed, their conversation little more than a series of low exchanges, a sentence or two about something broken that needs mending, a comment about how heavily the snow fell that day, a shared memory of someone who lived in this hut before them. Their voices are almost drowned out by the soft chorus of continued sleep around them. Yet there is a comfort in these whispered fragments, a way of remembering that, for all the weight of responsibility they carry, they are not just laborers struggling through frozen days, but two people who chose each other, who share not only straw and children, but also the strange suspended quiet of the winter night. When their eyelids grow heavy again, and the embers have been tucked once more under a protective layer of ash, they slip back under the blanket, rearranging themselves into the familiar pattern, fitting their bodies among their children's as easily as hands slide into worn gloves. Second sleep comes faster, denser, and for a while longer the hut returns to full stillness, drifting along in that dark river of hours that separates one hard day from the next. Outside, the frost continues to build delicate patterns on the door, and the wind keeps singing its low, endless song across the fields. But in here the question of how people endure such winters has, at least for this night, a simple answer: together, in straw and smoke and shared breath, doing just enough to keep the cold world outside and the small flame of life alive until the pale light of morning seeps in through the cracks again. Morning in a medieval hut doesn't arrive with a sudden burst of brightness or the cheerful warmth you might associate with sunrise. Instead, it seeps into the room like a hesitant intruder, a pale, diluted light that threads its way through the cracks in the walls and the thin seams of the thatch, faint as breath on glass. The second sleep unravels slowly, not because the night has been comfortable, but because the body clings to whatever warmth it has earned during the dark hours. The first to wake is often not human at all. It is the cow in the corner, shifting her weight with a deep rumbling sigh, stretching her limbs carefully as if mindful of the sleeping bodies nearby. Her breath forms soft white clouds in the cold air, and each plume seems to nudge the room gently toward morning. You hear her hooves scrape against the packed earth and feel the subtle tremor of that movement through the straw beneath you. The pig follows with a snort, rolling itself more fully upright, the animal warmth radiating from its hide fading into the chill that presses insistently from every direction. The dog, curled by the door, lifts its head and blinks, its ears twitching at distant sounds outside the hut, perhaps footsteps crunching in snow or a neighbor calling softly to a half-frozen rooster. Inside, the human sleepers begin to stir as the temperature shifts around them. The father is the first to sit up, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands before brushing frost from his beard. His breath drifts visibly in front of him as he looks around, checking instinctively on each family member, counting silently as his gaze moves from child to elder. In this world, waking is always accompanied by the small fear that someone might not wake at all. The mother wakes next, though her eyes have opened and closed many times through the night. Each rustle of a child, each cough from the grandmother pulling her briefly back into awareness. She rises slowly, her joints stiff from cold, and the weight of the others pressed against her, and wraps a shawl around her shoulders before kneeling beside the hearth. Her fingers disappear into the ashes, feeling for life, seeking the faintest ember. For a moment her hand is still. Then a small spark glimmers against her fingertips. She exhales a quiet sigh of relief and begins to coax the fire back into being. The children, still half swallowed by their dreams, curl closer together for a few seconds after their parents rise. Their cheeks are flushed from being nestled against warm bodies, but the air around them is already losing the heat gathered through the night, and the youngest whimpers as the cold nips at his toes. The mother, aware without turning, lifts the heavy woolen blanket and tucks it around him once more, buying him a few more minutes of warmth. The grandmother moves last. Her breaths are shallow, her hands trembling slightly as she pushes herself upright, but she is alive, and for the small community within this hut, that single fact feels like a victory. She brings a hand to her chest and murmurs a prayer of thanks. Not elaborate, not poetic, just a few simple words shaped by breath that fogs the morning air. By now, the mother has fed a handful of kindling to the embers, and flames begin to lick up the small twigs, casting long orange shapes across the walls. The firelight reveals the hut in all its raw truth, the blackened rafters heavy with soot, the walls patched in dozens of places where mud has been pressed into cracks, the straw floor uneven and darkened from months of use. In the soft glow, nothing looks elegant, but everything looks worn in a way that feels almost sacred. Objects shaped by survival, touched and retouched by generations of hands. The smell of smoke mixes with the faint scent of warm animal breath and the earthy odor rising from the floor. It is the aroma of morning in this world, rough, honest, and filled with quiet purpose. The father takes the wooden bucket and approaches the cow, pressing his forehead briefly against her flank in a gesture that is half affection, half gratitude. The cow responds with a gentle huff of warm air, shifting her weight to help him. Milking her is a slow, rhythmic act, and each drop that hits the pail feels like a small triumph against the cold. The mother pours a thin layer of water into the pot by the hearth, watching steam rise as the metal warms. She adds a handful of barley and the last crumbs of last night's pottage, stirring gently. Breakfast is not a meal to savor, but a necessity to endure. The children gather around, their small faces glowing in the firelight as they wait for the familiar smell of warm food to fill the room. The grandmother, now fully awake, hums a low tune, a melody without clear lines, more a vibration of memory than a song, a fragment she might have learned decades ago in a hut just like this one. When the pottage is ready, bowls are passed around. The family eats slowly, the warm stew moving through their chests like a gentle spark. There are no spoons for everyone, so they take turns, careful and practiced. A scrap of bread is dipped into the pot, its edges softening from the heat. The youngest child giggles as he licks porridge from his fingers, warmth spreading across his small frame. Outside, the sky is turning from grey to a muted blue, and the sound of other huts awakening ripples through the village. A door creaks open on the far side of the lane. A rooster crows again, louder this time, more confident. Somewhere a woman calls softly to her goats, urging them to rise. Inside the hut, the family finishes their meal, each one licking the last trace of grain from the bowl, their bodies gathering strength for the long hours ahead. They will spend the day fetching frozen water, tending animals, mending tools, repairing thatch, scraping frost from walls, and doing everything they can to keep the winter from reclaiming their home. But for these few minutes, the warmth of the fire, the closeness of shared breath, and the lingering comfort of sleep create a small island of peace in the middle of a hostile world. The mother wipes down the pot, the father sets the bucket aside, and the children begin to dress, pulling on stiff wool and cracked shoes, preparing to face the unrelenting cold outside. Before they leave the warmth of the hearth, the grandmother murmurs one final blessing, not loud and not meant for show, but sincere enough to sit gently in the air of the hut like a thin ribbon of hope. And as the family steps toward the door, the fire blazing once more behind them, you can almost feel the cold waiting outside, sharp, vast, ancient, ready to bite at their cheeks and stiffen their hands. But the hut, humble and smoky and patched in a dozen places, has seen them through another night, and as you watch them step into the snow-dusted morning, you understand that this is how medieval peasants survived the coldest winters, not through comfort, not through abundance, but through ritual, closeness, resilience, and the small, stubborn flame of warmth they kept alive together. The day outside the hut passes in a way that feels both extremely long and strangely short. The hours marked not by clocks or bells but by the shifting weight of light across the snow and the rhythm of labor carved into muscle and memory. The father moves through the fields and along the frozen paths with steady determination, gathering wood from hedgerows where he will not be punished for taking it, tapping the ice on the water trough to free what little remains liquid beneath, checking traps set days earlier in the hope of catching enough meat to flavor the next pottage. The mother tends to the endless cycle of tasks that fill every cold season, mending wool with numb fingers, beating dirt from cloaks, washing what cloth she can near the indoor fire so it does not freeze solid outside, and ensuring the children stay warm enough to avoid illness but active enough to help. By midday the sky has softened to a dim pewter glow. Light spreads across the snow in wide flat sheets, making the world appear both close and far away at once. The sound of tools clinking, animals lowing, and neighbors calling to one another fills the village in a thin chorus, hardly rising above the weary wind that crosses the fields like a tired traveler. This is not a world of sudden excitement or dramatic events. It is a world of repetition, of surviving winter, one slow, deliberate action at a time. As the hours pass, the cold tightens again, like a creature returning from a brief retreat. The children's cheeks redden and crack in the wind. The father's breath leaves long trails in front of him, and frost gathers on lashes like white dust. Even the animals grow restless, seeking shelter long before the sun begins to drop. By mid-afternoon, the sky has shifted from grey to a bluer, colder hue, an unmistakable sign that night will arrive early and hard. Inside the hut, the grandmother watches the light dim from her place near the hearth. She has been feeding small twigs and bits of dried moss into the fire throughout the day, tending it like a timid flame of hope. Every so often she rubs her hands together over the rising heat, her eyes clouded but alert. She knows better than anyone that the fire is more than warmth. It is the thin thread that separates her family from what waits outside. When the father returns, his cloak stiff with frost, he carries a bundle of sticks and a small wrapped parcel, a rabbit caught in one of the traps he set days earlier. The mother's eyes brighten at the sight, not because it promises a feast, but because it can transform their pottage into something richer than usual. Every scrap of the animal will be used, the meat for stew, the bones for broth, the fur for patching or lining boots. In the Middle Ages, waste is a luxury no one can afford. As evening settles in, the hut becomes a space of quiet preparation. The children close the wooden shutter against the creeping cold, stuffing straw in the cracks around it with their small fingers. The father sharpens a knife by the fire, the stone scraping softly with each stroke. The mother hangs the rabbit from a hook to dress it, while the pot warms again on the hearth. The grandmother hums a slow rhythm, perhaps a song from her own childhood hut, melodic and worn like river stones smoothed over years. The smell of stew begins to fill the room, a mixture of fat, root vegetables, herbs and wood smoke that wraps around the senses like a blanket. Even though the stew is thin, the scent alone brings a sense of abundance. The children hover close, drawn by the warmth and the promise of food, their cheeks glowing gold from the fire. Outside, night arrives without ceremony. One moment the air is blue, the next it is black. Only the moon and a few cold stars cast faint light over the frost-hardened village. You can hear the distant creaking of wood from other huts as they settle under the weight of another freezing night. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barks twice, then falls silent. Inside, the family gathers for supper. The stew is ladled carefully, the portions small but hot. The father closes his eyes briefly as he tastes the broth, and you can almost feel the warmth sliding through him after a day of biting wind. The mother leans over the youngest child, wiping his chin as he slurps the liquid with satisfied little sighs. The grandmother eats slowly, savoring each mouthful, letting the heat spread through her thin limbs like a blessing. After supper, the roles shift once more. The pot is rinsed with a splash of precious water and placed near the hearth to dry. The children help sweep the floor, gathering the old straw and stuffing it into the corners for insulation. The pig settles into its place, snorting contentedly, while the cow folds her legs beneath her, her huge body radiating silent warmth. Then comes the ritual of bedding down again. Fresh straw is spread on top of the flattened layer beneath. The children shake out the blankets, beating dust and ashes into the air, where they drift briefly before settling again on hair, clothes, and rafters. The mother checks the walls where the wind slipped in last night and pushes more cloth into the gaps. The father lowers the shutter one final time, bolting it against the cold and perhaps against less tangible worries. Finally, they all climb into the shared bed of straw and wool. The day's exhaustion settles into their bones, making even the scratchiest blankets feel forgiving. The mother lies down beside the father. The children curl around them, and the grandmother nestles close to the pig for warmth without shame or hesitation. In the Middle Ages, dignity is not measured by distance or privacy. It is measured by survival, by the ability to keep everyone alive through another night. As they settle, the fire dwindles to a slow pulse of orange light, and the hut begins its nightly transformation from a place of labor and eating to a vessel of sleep and breath. The father's breathing deepens first, then the children's bodies grow still. The grandmother murmurs a final short prayer that dissolves into the air. The mother rests a hand over the youngest child's heartbeat, feeling its steady rhythm beneath her fingers. The wind rises outside, brushing along the walls like an old ghost, testing for weaknesses. But the family is already drifting into sleep, swallowed by warmth that is fragile and temporary, but enough, always just enough, to keep the cold world outside from claiming them. And so the night closes again around the hut, not with dramatic silence, but with the quiet, enduring music of survival. The fire's soft crackle, the rustle of straw, the sighs of resting bodies, and the steady beat of hearts lying shoulder to shoulder in the dark. As the night reaches its coldest hour, the hut shrinks into itself like a living creature trying to protect its heart. The fire, now reduced to slow-breathing embers, paints the walls in a dim, pulsating glow that rises and falls with each tiny shift in the ash. The air is thick with the mixed scents of wool, smoke, damp earth, and the lingering sweetness of rabbit broth. Everyone sleeps in the same deep, uneven rhythm, a communal tide that ebbs and flows as bodies adjust, murmurs slip out, and dreams tug softly at their thoughts. But outside, the wind continues its long, low howl across the frozen fields, threading through the bare branches and scraping softly against the thatched roof. It is the kind of wind that seems almost intentional, like a restless spirit pressing its face against the village, searching for gaps, testing doors, whispering warnings through every crack it can find. In the Middle Ages, people did not call this merely weather. They recognized it as a presence, a force, a reminder. The father stirs first. Some instinct older than memory pulls him from sleep. His eyes open into a darkness only lightly scratched by the glow of embers. He listens, breath held. The wind hisses along the outside wall again. But that is not what woke him. He knows the language of the hut, the settling creaks, the shifting animals, the soft breathing of each family member. But this sound is different. It is faint, almost shy, but unmistakable. A knock. Not loud, not insistent. Just a small, uncertain tap on the wooden door. The dog's ears lift instantly. He doesn't bark, but a quiet rumble vibrates in his chest. The pig snorts, half awake. The cow raises her head, alert. Even the grandmother's eyes flutter open, her breath catching slightly in her throat. Very few people knock on doors in winter nights. Anyone still awake at this hour is either desperate or dangerous. According to medieval customary laws preserved in local court rolls, no honest traveller would willingly cross a village after sundown in the hard months. To knock at a door meant one thing: something was wrong. The father shifts carefully, untangling himself from the nest of family limbs. The cold strikes him immediately, sharp and ruthless, creeping up his legs as he stands. The mother wakes too, her eyes searching his face, reading the tension in his shoulders. She whispers his name, barely audible, a question shaped by fear more than sound. Another knock, this time softer, as though the visitor is losing courage. The father steps quietly across the straw-covered floor. Each crunch feels impossibly loud in the stillness. He pauses near the door and glances back at the mother. She nods once. Though fear coils in her stomach, this is the way of things. To refuse a knock in winter could mean sentencing someone to death. Hospitality is not a choice but a duty, a moral fabric that holds a fragile community together. He unbolts the door slowly. The cold rushes in immediately, sharp, metallic, and vast, as if the whole night is trying to enter at once. The wind curls around his ankles, carrying the smell of snow and distant pine. A figure stands in the doorway, hunched under a tattered wool cloak crusted with frost. His face is shadowed beneath a hood, but his breath spills into the room in ragged white bursts. His hands tremble visibly. Whether from cold or fear it is hard to tell. For a moment, neither the father nor the stranger speaks. Then the visitor lowers his hood just enough for the firelight to catch his features. A young man, perhaps 20, his cheeks hollow, his lips cracked from wind and hunger. "I beg shelter," he whispers, voice thin as a reed. "Just for the night." In many medieval villages, an unexpected visitor at such an hour would raise suspicions. Thieves, wanderers, or men fleeing debts were known to exploit the kindness of isolated families. But the father sees something fragile in the young man's eyes, something desperate enough to override caution. He steps aside. "Come in." The stranger hesitates, then crosses the threshold, stamping snow from his boots. The mother silently rises to her knees and gestures toward the hearth. Without a word, she ladles a small amount of leftover broth into a wooden bowl, far less than they can spare, but far more than the stranger has seen in days. The young man accepts it with both hands. As if receiving a relic, he drinks slowly, reverently. The firelight reveals the rough texture of his skin, the lines carved by cold around his eyes, the way his shoulders sag with exhausted gratitude. The children, half awake, stare at him with wide, solemn eyes. The grandmother watches too, but her gaze is sharper, thoughtful, as though she is searching the stranger's face for some kind of omen. In her world, nothing happens without meaning. A knock at this hour might be mercy or warning. "Where are you coming from?" the father asks quietly. The stranger swallows and raises his gaze. "The next village, ours burned." The words fall into the silence like stones into a frozen lake. Even the wind outside seems to pause. "Burned in winter." The mother's hand flies to her mouth. The grandmother closes her eyes. The father's jaw tightens. Fire in these months doesn't just take homes. It takes livestock, grain stores, tools, blankets, everything a family needs to outlast the cold. If the stranger's story is true, he is not simply lost. He is the lone ember of a life extinguished by tragedy. As the young man shivers by the fire, the father gently pushes the door shut again, bolting it tightly. Outside, the wind resumes its lonely cry across the fields, but inside, the hut begins to rearrange itself around the new presence. The mother rises and pulls an extra scrap of wool from a peg on the wall, draping it over the stranger's shoulders. The children shift in the straw, making space with instinctive generosity. The father offers the warmest corner closest to the hearth. And so, quietly, the stranger becomes part of the night's fragile warmth, another body in the patchwork of survival. As he settles into the straw, eyes already drooping with exhaustion, the family sinks back into their shared bed, weary but accepting. In this world, every extra heartbeat is both a burden and a blessing. The fire cracks softly, as if acknowledging the newcomer. The wind presses against the hut once more, disappointed at being denied. And slowly the room returns to that deep collective breathing, the sound of human beings holding the darkness at bay, if only for a few more hours. The hut settles back into its fragile rhythm, yet the presence of the stranger introduces a subtle pressure to the air, an almost imperceptible tightening that comes whenever one more body is folded into a space already stretched to its limits. making the straw rustle in a slightly different cadence, casting an extra uncertain silhouette against the soot-darkened walls, and prompting even the animals to shift their positions as if silently acknowledging that the balance has changed. The dog inches closer to the children with a protective curl of its spine. The pig emits a brief, questioning snort before relaxing again, and the cow lifts her heavy head for a moment to gaze at the newcomer with calm, unblinking eyes before settling back into her breathing. The young man remains seated near the embers, the bowl cupped between his hands, as if it were a relic of warmth he fears might disappear, and although his breath still shivers with cold, the tremors gradually fade into a kind of exhausted heaviness that seems to press down on his bones. The mother watches him with the quiet vigilance of someone who understands both compassion and scarcity, knowing that an unexpected guest can strain the already thin thread of winter provisions, yet equally aware that refusing him shelter would have been an act unthinkable in a world where survival often rests on the mercy of others. In medieval villages, the arrival of any stranger at night, especially during the frozen months, carried an echo of unease, because wanderers could be dangerous or desperate. Yet a frozen man at the door was a moral command that no one could ignore, and so when the young man finally lowers the empty bowl and the father asks what happened, the story that spills out is soaked in grief. A spark, perhaps from a cooking fire or a candle knocked over, caught the wind, leapt to the thatch, and in a matter of minutes, transformed the row of huts into a chain of torches, too swift and savage to extinguish with water, that froze before it reached the flames, taking with it his parents, his sister, and the only home he had known, leaving him running through the cold, with nothing but instinct pulling him away from the disaster. The weight of this account settles over the hut like a second darkness, and although the children listen with wide, solemn eyes, and the grandmother's fingers drift automatically to her chest in an old gesture of prayer, the father simply nods with the grave resignation of someone who understands that fire is a predator more feared than wolves or hunger, especially in winter when it devours tools, grain, animals, and hope in a single breath. He tells the stranger that he may sleep here for the night, and that the morning will decide what comes next, and the young man bows his head, overwhelmed by the relief of being permitted to share even a corner of warmth. After the mother offers him a scrap of wool, and the children shift instinctively to make space for him, the stranger curls up on a fresh patch of straw, drawing the cloth around his shoulders with the tentative carefulness of someone who has not felt safe in a long time. And as the room folds itself around him, the dog rises, sniffs him once in quiet assessment, and then settles close enough to suggest acceptance. For a moment, the fire glows brighter, reflected in the sheen of his tired eyes, before the embers dim again into their slow, pulsing breath. The grandmother begins to hum a lullaby, soft, wavering, the tone of a melody passed through so many winters that it barely survives as sound, but lives instead, as vibration in her chest, and the whole hut seems to drift on that sound, suspended briefly between fear and comfort, hardship and mercy, as the wind resumes its slow pressure against the walls, sliding a cold finger along the seams of the door and rattling the shutter as if displeased at being kept outside. Just as everyone begins to sink back into the collective breathing of sleep, the stranger, lying with his back to the firelight, speaks in a voice so faint it almost dissolves into the room, confessing that before the fire consumed his village, he heard footsteps moving between the huts, not the quick scamper of animals, but the measured tread of a person walking in the dark, a detail he shares almost unwillingly, as though uncertain whether it is memory or imagination, and the father's eyes open in an instant, though he remains still, listening. The mother asks gently whether the sound could have been a dog or a deer, but the stranger shakes his head in the dimness, whispering that it was neither, that it was unmistakably human, and his hesitation, mixed with the raw weight of his loss, makes the words tremble in the air. The grandmother, who has drifted between waking and sleep, opens her eyes and murmurs that some walk in the night who should not, a superstition carried from her youth, that the mother tries to silence with a stern glance, though the children are already sliding back toward dreams and hear nothing. The father refuses to feed the fear, nor to dismiss it, knowing that winter nights sharpen the imagination, and that stories can spread like sparks, so he simply instructs everyone to sleep, to rest while warmth allows it. Gradually, the tension eases again. The stranger closes his eyes, though unease clings faintly to him, like frost unwilling to melt. The grandmother exhales slowly. The mother drapes an arm across her youngest child, grounding herself in the small heartbeat beneath her palm, and the fire settles back into its steady glow. Outside, the wind hums along the walls like a creature pacing the perimeter of the hut. Inside, the breath of each sleeper folds into the room's fragile warmth, and despite the shadow of the stranger's recollection, sleep slowly reclaims the hut, deep and unbroken, because in a medieval winter the body knows only one truth. You sleep when warmth permits it. You rest because tomorrow will demand everything again, and you trust that the thin wooden walls and the shared human closeness will hold the darkness at bay for just one more night. The night deepens around the hut with a slow, heavy inevitability, the kind of darkness that does not simply fall but settles into every crevice of wood and straw, until the very air feels thick enough to touch, and as the warmth of shared sleep gathers once more, you notice the faint shift in rhythm that marks a medieval night passing from its first quiet into the deeper, more fragile hours when dreams grow vivid, and the boundary between waking and imagination thins like the last ember in the hearth. The fire has sunk so low that it no longer throws light but only a dull, reddish pulse beneath its blanket of ash, and that glow paints the sleeping faces around you in soft, uneven shadows, shadows that stretch and breathe with the rise and fall of each chest, merging the family, the stranger, and even the animals into a single mass of warmth and exhaustion, as if the hut itself has drawn them close and wrapped its crude wooden frame around them in a protective embrace. Outside, the wind circles the walls like a patient hunter, its long hollow sigh threading through the cracks with a cold so sharp it seems to hiss when it meets the faint heat leaking through the seams. You lie half awake, suspended in that peculiar middle place where thought becomes fluid and senses drift toward dream. And in that drifting you begin to hear the textures of the night more clearly, the subtle creak of the roof beams adjusting under the weight of snow, the faint rustle of straw as someone unconsciously shifts their weight in sleep, the soft grunt of the pig rearranging itself deeper into its bedding, and the rhythmic, almost tender sound of the cow's breath rising in slow warm clouds that mingle with the smell of smoke and wool and humanity. It is in this fragile stillness that the mind wanders where it pleases, unanchored by the duties of daylight, and you can almost understand why medieval people believed dreams were messages from beyond, because the night here feels porous, thin, as though something larger presses against the walls just out of sight, listening, watching, waiting, not with menace, but with the quiet patience of winter itself, a force so vast and ancient that it moves not with intent but inevitability. The stranger turns slightly in his sleep, a low sound escaping him, the kind that belongs to a dream too heavy to stay silent, and for a long moment he lies still before his breath catches again, more sharply this time, as though his mind has returned to the fire that consumed his village, and the mother, who seems to hear even while half asleep, murmurs a soft calming sound across the dark, a simple exhale shaped like comfort, a gesture made without waking, born from instinct rather than thought. In that moment you realize how deeply intertwined the rhythms of this room have become, how each person's breath affects the next, how every movement is absorbed into the collective warmth like ripples into water, and you understand that this world, though harsh beyond measure, has its own kind of intimacy, one forged not in luxury or ease, but in the quiet certainty that survival depends on nearness, on shared heat, on the unspoken agreement that no one faces the cold alone. The grandmother shifts next, her old bones protesting with a faint series of cracks, and she mutters something unintelligible, perhaps only a fragment of dream, though her voice carries the brittle weight of years lived through winters even harder than this one. Her hand gropes gently across the straw until it finds the edge of the blanket covering the youngest child, and she tucks it more securely around him before drifting back into breathy, uneven sleep. Outside, the wind presses again, harder this time, a long, low moan scraping against the thatch with a sound almost like words, and though you know it is nothing more than air and ice moving through brittle reeds, the noise snakes its way into your imagination, the way it must have done for countless villagers across the centuries, feeding the old belief that the night was full of unseen presences, spirits wandering the frozen paths, ghosts of the hungry or the lost, or simply the echoes of fear shaped into stories to explain what could not be controlled. The father, lying half-turned toward the fire, opens his eyes briefly, perhaps awakened by the wind, perhaps by the stranger's restless dreams, and he listens, motionless, evaluating the sounds with the instinctive caution of a man who has spent too many winters relying on his senses to protect those who sleep near him. After a long moment he exhales slow and steady, reassured enough to close his eyes again, though his hand remains close to the small wooden club resting near the hearthstones, not from paranoia, but from the simple truth that the world does not pause its dangers just because a man is asleep. Gradually, the room's breathing settles once more into a single rhythm, the fire giving off its faint glow, the animals contributing their steady warmth, the children murmuring in soft rhythmic patterns, and the stranger finally slipping into a quieter sleep as exhaustion overrides fear, and the hut, small and crude though it is, becomes again a pocket of warmth carved out of a world otherwise made of frost and silence. You feel your own consciousness sinking deeper now, lulled by the symphony of breath, by the soft rustle of straw, by the distant drum of wind on frozen fields, and it occurs to you with a kind of peaceful inevitability that in places like this sleep was not merely a biological need, but a form of surrender, a shared act of faith that the walls would hold, the fire would survive, and morning, however pale or cold, would eventually find its way back through the cracks in the wood. And as your thoughts slide into the soft, dark quiet beneath waking, you understand why medieval people feared the night, and yet trusted it, why they told stories about spirits in the wind, but still slept deeply beside those they loved, and why, in the face of hunger, fire, sickness, and winter itself, they found comfort in the simplest truth of all, that warmth shared is warmth multiplied, and that sleep, fragile, imperfect, communal, was the closest thing they had to peace. The night presses deeper around the hut, until the world outside feels like nothing more than an endless sheet of frozen darkness, stretching far beyond the forest line, and inside, the last glow of the hearth flickers beneath a soft layer of ash, painting the walls with a trembling red that seems to breathe in time with the sleepers. You lie there, suspended in that quiet heaviness, feeling the warmth of gathered bodies mixing with the scent of wool, smoke and straw, and for a long moment it is impossible to tell where your breath ends and theirs begins, as though the entire hut has become a single living creature drifting through the coldest hours of the night. The stranger stirs again, not violently, but with the small, unconscious tension of someone whose dreams offer little escape, and a faint sound leaves his throat, a half-formed sigh or the beginning of a name before his body relaxes into the straw once more, though even in sleep his fingers curl toward the scrap of wool around his shoulders, with the instinct of someone still running from a memory. Beside him the dog adjusts its position, shifting closer until its flank touches the stranger's arm, an act so simple and pure that it seems to melt a little of the room's unease, because animals do not comfort lightly, and their trust often carries more truth than any spoken reassurance. A log somewhere inside the hearth collapses with a soft sigh, sending up a thin ribbon of smoke that drifts lazily toward the roof beams, where it lingers before escaping through the thatch in delicate spirals. The smell of it, warm, slightly sweet, tinged with the faint bitterness of peat, wraps around you like a second blanket, and you understand why peasants, for all the coughing and stinging eyes, found comfort in this smoky air, because it is the smell of fire still alive, still burning, still refusing to surrender to the cold that waits outside like a patient predator. The father shifts in his sleep, his hand brushing instinctively toward the wooden club near the hearth, a gesture so practiced it requires no thought. He does not wake fully, only turns slightly, his brow tightening for a moment as if his mind is listening more intently than his body. And then, reassured by some quiet signal only he can sense, he releases a slow breath and sinks deeper into rest, his chest rising and falling with the steady endurance of a man whose life has been built on patience, vigilance, and silent gratitude. The grandmother, lying near the cow's warm flank, begins to murmur in her sleep, soft, rhythmic words that drift into the air like the remnants of a forgotten prayer, her voice so fragile it feels like part of the wind. Her hands, knotted with age, move unconsciously toward the child beside her, touching his shoulder lightly before settling back into the straw. And the boy shifts closer, his breath calming as if drawn into her quiet orbit, their shared warmth glowing faintly in the dim light. Beyond the walls the wind rises, not with the sharp, angry voice it used earlier, but with a long, low moan that seems to travel across the frozen fields and slip between the huts of the village like an unseen wanderer. It brushes against the planks with a sound that could almost be footsteps on snow, slow and measured, and though your mind insists it is only the storm stirring again, something about the rhythm carries an eerie familiarity that echoes the stranger's fear. Yet inside the hut no one wakes, their sleep held not by ignorance but by exhaustion, so deep it shields them from imagination's tricks. You lie there listening, letting the wind's song weave itself into the quiet chorus of breathing, and you begin to realize that medieval nights were never truly silent, that beneath every moment of stillness lived a tapestry of subtle sounds, fire settling, straw shifting, animals breathing, the distant bark of a dog, the sigh of a neighbor turning over in another hut. And these textures of darkness shaped their world far more intimately than daylight ever could, teaching them to navigate life by listening rather than seeing, by sensing rather than knowing. The sound fades gradually, replaced by a softer hush that settles over the village like a blanket of snow, and inside the hut the fire sends up one last tiny spark before sinking again into its hidden glow, the air warming slightly as the embers rearrange themselves beneath the ash. The warmth spreads slowly across the room, softening the edges of cold that cling stubbornly to the door and the stone threshold, and you feel your muscles unwinding in response, surrendering to the same ancient rhythm that has carried peasants through countless winter nights. Your eyelids grow heavy, drawn down by the gentle tug of sleep that returns in waves, and you let your thoughts dissolve into the warm darkness around you, understanding on some deep instinctive level that rest in this world is not simply sleep, but an act of survival, a temporary refuge from the cold and the hunger, and the fear that daylight will bring again. And as you drift toward that quiet place, surrounded by the breath of people who have welcomed you into their fragile circle of warmth, you find yourself feeling something unexpected, something small and profound, gratitude for the softness of the straw beneath your cheek, for the heat of bodies nearby, for the faint purr-like rumble of the cow, and even for the stubborn ember that still fights to keep the night at bay. Little by little, the room, the fire, the sounds, the worries, and even your own thoughts sink into a slow-flowing quiet, and the last thing you feel before sleep takes you entirely is the warmth of the hut settling over you like a promise, a whisper that no matter how cold the world outside becomes, here, just for this night, you are not alone. The night sinks into an even deeper stillness, the kind of darkness that feels almost physical, as though the world outside the hut has vanished into a void of frost and silence, and inside, the warmth of the shared bodies radiates in soft pulses that ebb and flow like the breath of some enormous creature curled around you. The fire no longer shines but glows faintly beneath its pale shell of ash, a tired heart that beats only to remind you that it is still alive beneath the quiet. The stranger breathes more evenly now, his earlier tremors softened by exhaustion and warmth, and the tension that clung to him when he first lay down begins to loosen in small, unguarded gestures. His fingers uncurled from the wool scrap, his brow smoothing as though the memories of fire and loss drift for a moment out of reach. Beside him, the dog has pressed its body so close that their breaths rise together in the same slow rhythm, and there is something oddly reassuring in that closeness, as if even an animal can sense when a human's fear needs to be softened by presence alone. The children are a tangle of limbs and blankets, shifting occasionally in tiny bursts of dream-bound movement, and each time one of them stirs, the entire arrangement adjusts, like a murmured conversation. One child rolling into another, the mother instinctively reaching a hand toward the nearest small body, without fully waking, the grandmother pulling the edge of a blanket a little higher over a shoulder that has slipped free into the cold. In this hut, sleep is not stillness but choreography, a slow tidal movement of warmth and instinct passed between generations. A faint crack runs along the roof beam as the weight of new snow settles onto the thatch with a heavy sigh, and the sound ripples through the room like the shifting of an old wooden spine. The cow lifts her head for an instant, ears flicking as if counting the tremor, then lays it back down, satisfied that whatever moved was merely weather and not danger, and the pig, half buried in straw, grunts softly in agreement, before continuing its rhythmic breathing. The wind outside returns with a low, steady hum, not the earlier moaning or the sharp whistling that foretells storms, but a more measured, almost contemplative sound that glides across the frozen fields and presses itself lightly against the sides of the hut, probing the cracks as though curious rather than hostile. Its presence is persistent yet strangely gentle, a reminder that the world beyond these thin walls is vast and indifferent, but not always cruel. As you listen, your mind drifts into the peculiar clarity that lives between sleep and waking, a place where thoughts no longer follow the rules of daylight, but drift like embers carried upward on slow rising heat, forming images that are neither dream nor memory. You see flickers of fields in summer, golden and warm, though the ground outside lies buried in ice. You hear echoes of laughter from market days long gone, though the night here is silent except for breath and wind, and you feel yourself travelling through the soft corridors of imagination, the way medieval peasants must have done, weaving small comforts out of memory in nights too long to endure with thought alone. The father shifts once more, this time with a deeper exhale that sounds like the final surrender of a man slipping fully into rest after forcing vigilance to hold him awake longer than his body desired. His hand, which rested near the wooden club, moves away from it now, fingertips brushing the straw as though even his instincts finally trust that the hut, for this brief stretch of night, holds no danger he cannot meet in dreams. The mother, curled around her smallest child, murmurs something, perhaps a name, perhaps a fragment of a lullaby she hasn't sung aloud in years, and the child responds by nestling closer, pressing his forehead into the crook of her arm. Their breaths mingle and rise in a soft rhythm that sways like a quiet chant, and you realize that in a place like this, tenderness is not expressed through words or gestures, but by the simple, steady act of sharing warmth through the dark. Even the grandmother, who has lived through more winters than anyone else in the room, drifts deeper into sleep, her head tilted slightly toward the flickering red of the hearth, as though listening to an old familiar story being told by the fire itself. Her hands, worn and knotted, rest atop her blanket, fingers curled just enough to show she still dreams, perhaps of younger days or of summers long buried under the snow. You feel your own breath slowing to match the collective rhythm, a quiet surrender that spreads through your limbs and softens the edges of your thoughts. The sounds of the hut, the gentle rustling of straw, the occasional click of cooling timber, the whisper moan of the wind, blend together into a single soundscape so ancient and primal that it feels like it has been playing since humanity first learned to shelter itself from the night. Little by little, the last traces of wakefulness slip through your fingers, and the world narrows to warmth, breath, and the faint, comforting glow of the embers. And just before you sink fully into sleep, you feel one final subtle truth settle over you like an invisible blanket, that here, In this crowded little hut where fear and hunger and winter press so closely, the simple act of sleeping side by side is an act of courage, of trust, of quiet defiance against the cold that waits outside. And with that thought you let the darkness take you, not as an enemy but as a companion, knowing that for one more night the fire holds, the walls stand, and the warmth of others keeps the world at bay. The night grows heavier still, settling over the hut like a thick woolen cloak that muffles every distant sound, until the world outside seems to shrink into nothing more than wind, frost, and the pale memory of starlight hidden somewhere behind thick winter clouds, and inside, the warmth has reached its most delicate balance, held together by breath, bodies, and embers that refuse to die even as the cold presses harder against the walls. The stranger shifts again, not with fear this time, but with the small, instinctive movement of someone finally falling into deeper rest, his muscles unclenching one by one as the last remnants of tension dissolve into the straw beneath him. The dog, sensing this softening, presses its nose briefly against his wrist before curling into a tight ball, its warm breath fogging faintly in the dimness, and the simple trust in that gesture lingers in the air like a blessing. The fire releases a slow, tired crack, one of those deep, resonant sounds that seem to roll through the wooden ribs of the hut, and the faint glow beneath the ash flickers upward, just long enough to illuminate the curved edge of the cow's flank, the gentle rise of the grandmother's breathing, and the slight outline of the father's hand resting on the straw, fingers splayed as though testing the warmth of the ground beneath him. The light fades almost at once, but its memory lingers on the inside of your eyelids like the afterimage of a candle. Somewhere far away, so distant it could be part of a dream, a wolf howls, a long, stretching note that drifts across the frozen fields and dissolves into the trees. The cow lifts her head in slow, measured concern, her ears turning toward the sound as if locating it across the miles of snow, but then she exhales heavily, deciding the danger is too far to matter, and she settles again into her patient breathing, her enormous body radiating warmth the way a fire radiates light. The father does not wake, but you can see his breath change slightly, deepening with the subconscious awareness of someone who has spent his entire life attuned to the voices of the night. Yet even with that subtle vigilance humming beneath his sleep, he does not rise or reach for the club. Something in the rhythm of the room assures everyone that the wolf is only a distant echo, one of the countless sounds that shape winter nights without breaking them. A tiny motion catches your eye. The mother, still asleep, pulls her eldest child closer, her arm curling around him with the slow, instinctive tenderness of someone whose love does not require wakefulness to express itself. The boy presses his face into her chest, his curls brushing her chin, and the sight is so quietly human, so universal across centuries that it feels more like memory than observation, as though you have stumbled into a moment repeated by countless families through all the long winters of history. The grandmother lets out a thin sigh, her breath trembling as though brushing against some dream she has not had in years. Her face softens in sleep, the lines smoothing into gentler shapes, and for a moment she looks younger, not in body but in the small, peaceful way aging memories sometimes lift the weight of time from the sleeping mind, reminding you that inside every elder lives the echo of a child who once curled against a similar fire, under a similar roof, in a winter not so different from this one. The wind circles the hut again, its cold fingers tracing every seam in the wood, every woven reed in the thatch, and every gap the family stuffed earlier with cloth and straw. Each time the wind finds resistance, it hums a different note, a shifting harmony that turns the walls into an instrument played by weather, and you can almost imagine that the hut itself is answering, settling, creaking, breathing, responding to the night in the only language it knows. It strikes you suddenly, quietly, that these sounds, the wind sighing, the fire's bitter exhale, the soft creak of timber, were once the entire soundtrack of human life after sunset. No distant engines, no hum of wires, no glow of lamps, only the dialogue between nature and shelter, with survival resting in the thin, fragile balance between the two. Your thoughts drift in slow circles, dissolving into a soft haze that feels like sinking into warm water, and you realize that you have begun to match the room's rhythm, your breath aligning with the warm pulse of bodies around you, your heartbeat slowing to the same ancient pace that lulled medieval families into their winter sleep, long before clocks or schedules existed. The night feels endless, but not hostile, just vast, patient, and indifferent, a silent world that wraps itself around the hut like a heavy blanket. A tiny ember flares unexpectedly beneath the ash, casting a faint glow across the father's cheek, highlighting the rough stubble, the worry lines that never fully disappear even in sleep, and the quiet strength in his features. The light reaches the mother next, painting her face in soft fading gold, then glides over the children, whose breaths puff lightly like small chimney clouds rising into the dim air. Finally, that little ember's glow washes across the stranger's face, revealing for an instant the raw sincerity of someone who has been given warmth he did not expect, safety he did not dare hope for, and a place, even if temporary, among people who owe him nothing, yet have offered him everything they have. The ember dims again, sinking into the ash like a tired eye closing, and the darkness returns, not frightening, not empty, but gentle and heavy, carrying the soft scent of smoke and wool and warmth. And as your own breathing slows into near-perfect harmony with the room, you feel yourself slipping into a deeper, quieter sleep, carried not by comfort, but by the simple, unbroken truth that in a world this cold survival is found not in walls or fire alone, but in the fragile miracle of sleeping close to others, trusting that warmth, breath, and closeness will hold the night together until morning finds its way back through the frost. The night folds even deeper into itself, taking on that peculiar density that makes time feel slow and syrup thick, as though each minute drips instead of passing. And inside the hut, the warmth becomes a kind of shared dream, a soft sphere of breath and body heat, suspended in a world otherwise carved from ice. The walls creak under the weight of settling frost. The thatch rustles like distant footsteps as snow slides gently down its slope. And in this dim cocoon of embers and shadows, you begin to sense how the medieval world lived, not against winter, but inside it. The stranger sleeps more peacefully now, his earlier tremors replaced by the slow, rolling breaths of someone who has finally surrendered to exhaustion. And as he shifts slightly, the dog adjusts too, lifting its head with a soft sniff before resting its muzzle against the stranger's knee, as if keeping silent watch over him. The firelight catches briefly on the dog's fur, revealing a faint shimmer of frost that must have clung to it when the stranger first entered, and as the last crystals melt, a faint steam rises that blends into the warm fog of human breath filling the tiny room. The father mutters something in his sleep, a single word, indistinct and hoarse, perhaps a name or a half-remembered warning, and though his eyes remain closed, his hand drifts instinctively toward his wife and children, brushing against their blankets as though ensuring they are still within reach. When the familiar sensation meets his fingers, his body relaxes at once, his jaw unclenching, and the heaviness of true rest finally settles onto him like a second blanket. The mother is lost in a deeper stillness, not motionless but wrapped in that gentle, protective sleep that mothers fall into after long days of worry. Even in dreams she responds to the faint movements around her, the child who nudges her shoulder with a tiny nocturnal murmur, the shifting warmth of bodies pressed close, the soft snort of the pig repositioning itself beneath a fresh mound of straw, and she adjusts without waking, moving with the rhythm of necessity and love that governs her every moment. The grandmother breathes in shallow, steady pulses, each inhale fragile but determined, the kind of breathing that seems to belong more to memory than to the present, and with every exhale her lips part slightly, releasing faint whispers that might be fragments of old prayers, or perhaps long-forgotten lullabies, or simply the restless drifting of a mind that has survived so many winters that sleep and dreaming have melted together into a single hazy realm. Outside, the wolf calls again, shorter this time, more distant, perhaps answered by another across the forest. and the sound rises above the frozen ground like smoke, slipping through the trees until it reaches the edge of the village. The hut reacts to it in almost imperceptible ways. The cow straightens slightly before lowering her head again. The pig's ears twitch beneath the straw, and even the baby, half buried in blankets between his parents, shifts with a small whimper before settling once more. The wind follows the howl with a long, frigid sweep that rattles the wooden shutter as though testing its strength, and for a moment a thin line of icy air slips into the hut, brushing across the floor like a ghostly hand. The temperature dips by a breath, just enough for the straw to rustle with the sudden change, and the father's brow tightens instinctively, though he does not wake, as though his body recognizes the cold itself as a familiar intruder. You watch as the ember beneath the ash brightens again, stirred perhaps by the shifting draught or by the subtle movements of sleepers, and the brief flame it throws casts a fragile glow across the hut, soft orange brushing the edges of wool blankets, catching the shine on the cow's dark eye, glinting off the stranger's rough boots left near the door, and illuminating for a heartbeat the wooden beams above that are stained black with years of smoke, each streak a record of hundreds of nights exactly like this one. In that sudden shimmer of light, you notice something small, the herb bundle hanging near the hearth, swaying ever so faintly in the draught, its smell, sage, thyme, maybe even a trace of wormwood, mixing with the smoke to create a scent that feels both earthly and sacred, a reminder that to the people in this hut, the boundary between the practical and the spiritual was thin and permeable, as fragile as the thatch above their heads. And then the ember dims again, sealing the room back into darkness. Not sharp or frightening darkness, but warm, pulsing, communal darkness, heavy as sleep and soft as breath. Your own eyelids grow heavy as the hut's rhythm sweeps you further inward, and the last thing you register before sinking below the surface of consciousness is the quiet symphony around you. The cow breathing slow and warm, the pig shifting like a sleepy drum beat, the soft exhale of the stranger, the child's small fingers curling around a scrap of blanket, the grandmother's faint murmurs, the mother's steady heartbeat, and the father's deep grounding breath, every sound layered into the same ancient melody that has carried countless families through countless frozen nights. And as sleep wraps around you, thick and gentle, you understand with a clarity that does not need words that hear. In this fragile wooden hut surrounded by fields of ice, survival is not the work of fire alone, but of closeness, of breath shared in the dark, of bodies curled together against a world that does not care if they live or freeze. And yet they live anyway, night after night, warm in the knowledge that no one sleeps alone. The night has now reached that deepest, almost bottomless hour when time seems to pause between one breath and the next, when even the wind outside hesitates as though gathering its strength for another sweep across the frozen fields, and inside the hut, the darkness has settled into a warm, living cocoon woven from human breath, animal warmth, and the faint, stubborn glow of the dying fire that refuses, even now, to surrender entirely to the cold. The stranger, who only hours ago stood shivering at the door with smoke in his hair and grief in his eyes, now lies curved into the straw with a quietness that suggests his body has finally accepted safety. His chest rises in a slow, even rhythm, the dog's soft weight pressed along his side, anchoring him to this moment, to this warmth, to this fragile patch of shelter carved out of winter's teeth. And each breath he draws seems to carry away a little more of the terror that clung to him when he first entered the hut. The father sleeps deeply now, the kind of sleep earned through long days of labor and long nights of vigilance, his hand resting loosely over the coarse blanket that covers the children, fingers slightly open as if still prepared, somewhere beneath consciousness, to grip the wooden club beside him. His face relaxed in the faint ember glow, looks younger than it did in full firelight, the worry lines softened, the tension smoothed by the warmth of his family, pressed close around him. The mother lies curled like a protective halo around her youngest, her arm draped across his small form, her cheek resting lightly against his hair. Even in sleep, her body maintains its quiet instinct to shield and soothe, her breath slow and deep, rising in a faint, rhythmic motion that the children unconsciously mirror, as though they share not only a blanket but a single pulse that moves between them like an invisible tide. The grandmother, whose life has weathered more winters than the others can count, lies in her straw bed with her face turned toward the faint glow of the hearth, her lips parting occasionally in murmured fragments of dream or prayer. Every so often her fingers twitch beneath the blanket, as though reaching for something from years long gone. Perhaps a child she once held, a fire she once tended, or a night like this when sleep and memory braided themselves together in the cold. A soft rustle moves through the straw as the pig burrows deeper for warmth, stirring up a faint earthy scent that mixes with the smoky air and the animal heat radiating from the cow. The cow herself shifts her weight with a low rumbling sigh, the sound vibrating through the ground like a gentle drumbeat, a reminder that her warmth is one of the quiet miracles of this hut, her breath rising in slow clouds that help push back the edges of frost seeping beneath the door. Outside, the wolf's cry fades into the hollow distance, swallowed by the wide, indifferent night, but the wind answers with a long, low sweep that brushes past the hut like an icy hand searching for a weakness. It pushes against the shutter, makes the dried herbs sway faintly from the beam, and sneaks a whisper of cold beneath the door, a thin line of air that snakes across the floor before dissolving into the collective heat of sleeping bodies, unable to gain ground against the warmth gathered inside. The beams above you creak softly, not in warning but in the familiar language of wood expanding and contracting under the weight of snow. Tiny flakes loosen from the thatch and fall soundlessly down the wall, melting before they reach the straw floor, and these almost silent movements blend into the hut's nightly music, a tapestry of sound that medieval families knew by heart: the settling roof, the crack of cooling timber, the soft shuffle of animals, the murmurs of dreaming humans. Your thoughts drift through this soundscape like a slow river, moving without direction, touching fragments of memory and imagination, with the same softness as embers touching kindling. You think of daylight that will return eventually, pale and thin but still enough to pull the village back into movement. And you think of all the winters these families survived, not through strength alone but through this simple, quiet closeness, each person a source of heat, each sleeping breath a small rebellion against the cold. The ember beneath the ash glows suddenly brighter, expanding into a brief flicker that washes the father's face, then the mother's, then the stranger's in a faint bronze light before shrinking again, and in that quick moment, the hut looks almost like a painting, figures outlined in warm gold against a backdrop of deep black, their features softened, their burdens hidden, their hearts momentarily unguarded in the shared stillness of night. The light fades once more, but the warmth remains, a low hum that fills the space between bodies and settles over you like a heavy blanket, inviting your mind to sink deeper into rest. Your breath begins to match the slow rhythm of the hut, rising and falling in unison with those around you, and you feel that ancient sensation of becoming part of something larger than yourself, not through belief or ritual but through the simple primal act of surviving the cold together. And as your consciousness blurs at the edges, slipping towards sleep's warm pull, the last thing you hear is the faint rustling of straw as someone shifts, the quiet grunt of the pig, the cow's deep breath, and the soft exhale of a child, all blending into that deep, resonant calm that belongs only to winter nights in wooden huts, where warmth is shared, fear is eased, and the dark is held at bay not by walls or fire alone, but by the quiet, unwavering closeness of those who sleep beside you. The night settles into its final and most motionless depth, the hour when even the wind seems to fall into a kind of exhausted drift, brushing only lightly against the walls as though it too is growing weary of its long vigil over the frozen fields. And inside the hut, the warmth, fragile, flickering, but steadfast, wraps itself more tightly around the sleeping forms, sealing them into a single quiet organism, breathing softly against the harsh silence outside. The stranger has shifted once again, turning onto his back in a slow, unhurried motion that suggests the first true comfort he has felt since the night his home burned. His face, washed faintly by the dying ember glow, looks softer now, stripped of the fear he carried with him, and in the relaxed slack of his hands and the easy rise of his chest, you can sense a body remembering how to rest after too much running, too much cold, too much loss. The dog beside him dreams in small jerks of its paws, as though chasing something through the haze of instinct, its breathing soft and warm, its fur rising and falling with a steady rhythm that anchors the stranger's presence in this hut. Every so often the dog's ear flicks or its tail gives a slow thump against the straw, and even this tiny motion seems to reassure the room, a reminder that animals learn danger faster than humans, and sleep even faster when none is near. Near the fire's faint glow, the father and mother lie pressed close, their children nestled between them like smaller flames shielded by steady hands. The mother's breathing is so deep now that it syncs with the faint rattle of the shutter, the two sounds weaving together in the hush of the room, and her fingers, curled loosely over her youngest child's blanket, twitch now and then as though she is reaching through dreams to make sure he is still warm, still there, still part of her. The father's body, wide and strong from years of toil, lies curved protectively around them all, his arm draped with an unconscious instinct across the pile of limbs and blankets, and even as he sleeps, the faint tightening and loosening of his jaw tells you that some part of him stands guard in a realm deeper than waking, listening for any change in the hut's rhythm, an instinct older than villages, carved into the bones of every man who has ever kept a family alive through winter. The grandmother, lying just beyond the children's feet, breathes in slow, uneven waves that rise gently and fall with a faint tremor, yet there is peace in her face, in the faint sag of her cheeks and the softened lines around her mouth. She has surrendered completely to the night, her mind wandering wherever old memories carry it, her thin fingers curled into her blanket, as though holding on to the warmth the way she has held on to life, carefully, quietly, with a strength that hides inside gentleness. The cow, whose presence feels almost holy in its simplicity, stands half awake in the corner, shifting her weight from one hoof to the other with the slow patience of a creature accustomed to listening to the cold. Each exhale sends a soft plume of warm breath drifting upward, mingling with the faint, sweet smell of hay, and the pig, snuggled into a nest of straw nearby, snorts contentedly in its sleep, as though dreaming of grain scattered on a summer day. The wind outside rises for a moment, a slow dragging sound like a coarse cloth being pulled across the fields, and it presses lightly against the walls before fading again, leaving behind a thin draught that slips beneath the door and crawls timidly across the floor, but the warmth inside the hut pushes it back, the collective heat of bodies and animals forming a quiet resistance that stops the cold at the threshold like a guardian standing watch. A few flakes of snow slide off the roof and drift past the tiny window slit, whispering against the wood with a sound so soft it could be mistaken for a breath, and the beams above groan gently under the shifting weight. But the movement is familiar, almost comforting, like an old house stretching its joints in sleep after a long, cold day. The fire offers one last small spark, a tiny flicker that dances up from the ash like a firefly searching for light, illuminating the herb bundle swaying gently from the beam above. The smell of sage and dried thyme drifts faintly into the air, blending with the smoky warmth, and for a moment the whole hut feels suspended between worlds. The world of living breath and the world of old traditions, prayers, charms, and memories held in dried leaves tied with string. Your gaze drifts across the shapes around you, the curve of the mother's arm, the soft rise of blankets where the children sleep, the faint shine on the cow's flank, the stranger's relaxed face, the dog's curled form, and for a long, slow heartbeat you feel the weight of centuries settle around you, the quiet truth that thousands of winters have passed exactly like this, people sleeping close, animals breathing warmth into the dark, fire whispering its last sparks into straw-scented air. And as sleep finally pulls you downward with a gentle, inevitable tug, the last sensation you feel is the hut's shared heartbeat, slow and steady, a rhythm stitched together from all its living inhabitants. The breath of the mother, the rustle of the grandmother's blanket, the dog's faint whine, the cow's low exhale, the children's soft sighs, the stranger's rhythmic breathing, the father's deep, anchoring rest, each sound blending into the next, until the room becomes not many bodies, but one warmth. You drift under its shelter, into a sleep that feels older than history, wrapped in a darkness that is not frightening but protective, a darkness shaped by wood and straw, and the simple, stubborn miracle of warmth held against winter. And in that final moment of awareness, you understand why people survived nights like this. Because no one slept alone. The night sinks into a level of stillness so profound that even the air inside the hut feels suspended, as though the cold beyond the walls has pressed time itself into a slow, almost dreamlike pause, and within that heavy quiet every sound becomes magnified. The soft shuffle of straw when someone turns, the faint crack of a cooling timber, the gentle whisper of breath rising and falling in delicate patterns across the room like invisible waves. The stranger, who only hours ago arrived with fear stiffening his features, lies now in a position of honest, unguarded sleep, his limbs loose, his mouth slightly open, the exhaustion of flight and grief drained from his body under the steady warmth of the room. His hand rests near the dog's flank, close enough that their breaths mingle, and the dog, curled in a crescent shape against him, twitches occasionally in some muted dream, its paws pressing softly against the straw in tiny running motions that hint at a world it roams behind closed eyes. The father, who has spent the better part of his life weathering nights far colder than this, sleeps deeply with his arm draped protectively across the children, his body curved toward the fire in a quiet, instinctive shield. Even in sleep, his brow retains a faint furrow, a trace of vigilance that seems carved into him by years of responsibility. But the tension softens each time the children exhale against his side, as if their warmth melts through the armor he wears even in rest. The mother, pressed close to her youngest child, breathes with a steady cadence that could lull the entire hut into deeper drowsiness, if it were not already captured by sleep's slow tide. Her hand rises and falls with the rhythm of her child's breathing, her fingers flexing occasionally in a dream-born motion that resembles the act of soothing, as though even in unconsciousness she continues the tireless work of tending to those around her. The grandmother lies near the warmth of the cow, her body curled slightly toward the animal's slow, patient heat, her thin hands tucked beneath her chin. Every few breaths she murmurs something faint and unformed, the whispered remnants of a dream, or perhaps the drifting echo of prayers she has spoken so many times that they now live in her sleep as well, and her voice blends softly with the low, steady rumble of the cow's breathing, creating a quiet harmony that feels ancient and familiar. The pig shifts with a soft grunt, pushing straw beneath its belly with an almost contented determination, and its body adds yet another small pocket of warmth to the room. The animals here are not merely creatures sharing space with the family, but living sources of heat, comfort, and companionship, their breaths blending with human breaths in a seamless cycle of warmth and life that stands firm against the cold. Outside, the wind stirs again, but its voice has changed, no longer the long moaning sweep that speaks of gathering storms, but a gentler, almost contemplative drift, as though the cold itself has grown tired of its own persistence. It brushes along the thatch, slips through the narrow seams between wooden planks, and carries with it a faint whisper of snow. A tiny crackle from the hearth breaks the stillness, a sound so small it might be overlooked in the bustle of day, but here, in this hushed world, it rings out like a message, a reminder that the embers still live, that warmth persists even in its faintest form. A single spark flares, glows briefly, and reveals the delicate weave of smoke rising upward in a slow curling dance before disappearing through the shadows near the roof beams. That brief glow washes across the room, illuminating textures that daytime glances would never capture. The uneven grains of the wooden walls darkened by years of smoke. The faint shimmer of straw scattered like golden threads across the dirt floor. The soft, worn wool of blankets stitched and restitched over generations. The glint of the father's calloused knuckles. The delicate flutter of the child's lashes as he dreams. The serene contour of the stranger's face, no longer defined by fear but by rest. And then the ember dims again, leaving behind only the after-image of its warmth, a kind of quiet reassurance that settles into your bones as you listen to the layered tapestry of breath and warmth that fills the hut. The entire room now feels like a single heart beating slowly in the dark, pulse after pulse of shared survival, of lives intertwined, not by choice but by necessity, yet transformed by that necessity into something tender and profoundly human. In this small, crowded space, the boundaries between family and stranger, human and animal, age and youth, fear and comfort all blur into a single truth. Warmth is not owned here, it is shared. As your thoughts drift toward the edge of sleep again, you feel yourself becoming part of that shared rhythm, your breath sinking into sync with the breaths around you, your body relaxing into the warmth that wraps the room like a quiet embrace, and the darkness around you becomes soft rather than heavy, protective rather than empty. And just before sleep finally claims you, you understand deeply instinctively that nights like these were not merely endured but survived through closeness, through breath and body heat, through the unspoken trust that in the bitter, unforgiving cold of medieval winter, no one sleeps alone because sleeping together is what keeps everyone alive. The night settles into an even deeper layer of stillness, the kind that feels as if the entire world has inhaled and forgotten to exhale, and inside the hut this quiet expands slowly, filling every corner until even the smallest motion, a shift of a child's leg, the soft settling of straw, feels amplified against the vast silence of the frozen fields outside. The stranger sleeps heavily now, his face softened by the kind of rest that comes only after fear has loosened its grip, and although his dreams twist faintly behind his closed eyelids, shadows of fire, perhaps, or memories of the home he lost, his breath remains steady, rising from his chest in slow, measured waves that mingle with the warm animal scent around him. The dog remains curled against him, its body pressed close as though forming a protective barrier, its small size releasing into the dark like puffs of warm cloud. The father has sunk into the full weight of sleep, his mouth slightly open, his large frame curved instinctively around the family, as though forming the outer wall of a human fortress. Every now and then a faint twitch runs through his fingers, perhaps a dream of swinging an axe or tightening a rope, echoes of the day's exhaustion rising to the surface, only to be pulled back down by the heaviness of rest. The mother's breathing has settled into a slow, hypnotic rhythm, her lips parted just enough for a soft hum to escape whenever she exhales, and the child pressed against her belly stirs occasionally, rubbing his cheek against her tunic in a search for warmth and safety. Each time he shifts, she responds with a barely perceptible movement of her arm, a protective reflex unfolding even within the depths of sleep, her body remembering the duty of care long after her mind has drifted away. Near the cow's flank the grandmother slumbers, her dreams weaving into the quiet around her in whispered fragments, names perhaps or pieces of prayers spoken so many times they now echo through her sleep. The cow turns her head gently, giving a soft chuff of warm air that brushes over the grandmother's hair, as though acknowledging her presence, and the pig, sensing the movement, shifts deeper into the straw with a sound like a muffled sigh. Outside, the wind begins to move again, but in a different way now, colder, sharper, as though it has slipped through a new seam in the night. It travels across the frozen ground with a sound like fabric being drawn over stone, and when it reaches the hut, it presses itself against the door, rattling the latch just once before passing onward toward the forest, where the trees answer with a faint clatter of bare branches. A scattering of snow falls from the roof, sliding down the thatch in a soft, whispering cascade, and a few flakes sneak in through the tiniest crack near the window shutter, drifting slowly toward the earth floor like tiny drifting sparks of frozen light. They melt the instant they touch the warm ground, leaving no trace except a faint shiver of cold that moves briefly through the air before being swallowed by the hut's collective heat. The embers send up another gentle glow, one that spreads across the faces nearest the fire in a fleeting wave of amber light. The father's broad cheekbones, the mother's curved shoulder, the child's tiny hand resting atop the blanket, the stranger's jawline soft in its exhaustion, the grandmother's lined face smoothed by rest, the animals breathing in slow harmony, and for a moment the room looks like a scene frozen in oil paint, warm and human and impossibly still. The glow fades again but leaves behind a memory of warmth that seems almost brighter than the flame itself. And for a long stretch nothing moves except the breath of sleeping bodies, the slow blinking of the cow, and the nearly silent sway of the dried herbs hanging from the beam, their shadows stretching across the timber, like thin fingers tracing forgotten symbols in the dark. As you lie there drifting just above the threshold of sleep, you become aware of how deeply winter has wrapped itself around the hut, not with violence but with a kind of cold patience that waits at the door and presses at the walls, testing them, listening to the breaths inside. Yet the warmth within pushes back, not with power but with insistence, with the simple truth of shared heat and shared life. Slowly your own breath merges with the room's rhythm, your eyelids growing heavier with each exhale, your thoughts dissolving into the soft, formless quiet that surrounds you. The darkness becomes warmer, richer, almost tender, and as you slip deeper into it you understand something that no chronicle or textbook could ever convey, something that only nights like this can teach. It is the knowledge that survival, in a world this harsh, was not merely a matter of food or fire, but of togetherness, of bodies clustered close in the dark, of hands seeking hands even in sleep, of the quiet reassurance found in the steady rise and fall of breath beside you. It was trust woven through warmth, safety forged through closeness, and hope born not of daylight but of nights exactly like this one. And with that understanding resting softly against your mind, you finally let sleep take you fully, sinking into the ancient rhythm of the hut where the cold cannot follow, and where, for one more night, everyone is held by warmth, breath, and each other. The night has almost completed its slow passage across the sky, thinning at its edges, even though no light has yet appeared, and within the hut, the warmth that held everyone through the long hours has settled into a deep, steady hum, a final gentle pulse before morning begins to reclaim the world. The embers lie beneath their ash like tiny sleeping suns, no longer bright enough to illuminate faces, but warm enough that the cold cannot yet cross the threshold. The stranger remains asleep, his breath calm, his posture open, his body no longer curled in fear, but stretched in something that resembles trust. He looks less like a wanderer now and more like someone who belongs, at least for the moment, to the shared breath and shared survival that binds the hut together. The dog, loyal to its new proximity, has placed its head on the stranger's boot, as though guarding the last remnant of the road he carried in with him. The father rests with the kind of heaviness that follows a night of vigilance finally released, his arms still draped across the children, his grip loosened but not absent. If danger returned, even in sleep he would rise, but for now, with the night fading and the cold withdrawing in slow reluctance, his body allows itself a moment of true rest. The mother's breath remains steady, her face softened by the nearness of her children, her hand still curved protectively around the smallest, as though even dreams could not persuade her to let go. The grandmother sleeps in the gentle half-dreams of the old, her lips moving faintly around unspoken prayers, the cow's warm breath brushing across her hair like a quiet benediction, and the pig, deeply embedded in straw, emits a soft, almost contented grunt, adding its small thread of sound to the tapestry of life that fills the hut. But then something subtle shifts in the world beyond the door, not a sound, not a movement, but a change in the depth of the darkness. The first thinning of night as dawn gathers somewhere far beyond the horizon. It is not light yet, not even a hint of grey, but the air knows before the eye does. The wind, which had circled the hut like a restless sentinel, quiets in a way it never does in the heart of night. The cold's pressure lightens. The world holds its breath, preparing to turn. Inside the hut, the effect is immediate, though no one wakes because of it. The cow straightens slightly, sensing something ancient and instinctive. The grandmother shifts, muttering a small syllable shaped by memory rather than thought. The father's brow relaxes in the faintest way, as if some distant tension has loosened its grip. Even the fire seems to sense it, releasing one last faint sigh of warmth from beneath the ash, a final exhale marking the end of the darkest hours. And then, just as the wind stills completely, the first hint of dawn presses against the seam of the shutter. Not a ray of light, not even a brightness, but the faint softening of the blackness, the moment when darkness admits that it is no longer absolute. Morning is coming. It has not yet touched the world, but it has begun its slow approach. In the hut, the warmth feels different now, not a desperate clinging heat, but a gentle one, the kind that welcomes rather than defends. The bodies remain close, the breaths remain synchronized, but the sense of holding back the cold gives way to the quiet anticipation of what comes after. A new day, fragile but real, waiting on the other side of the frozen fields. For a long, breathless moment, the hut exists in the suspended transition, balanced perfectly between the end of night and the beginning of morning. You feel it in the stillness of your own body, in the softness settling into the room, in the way the gloom lifts by the smallest fraction, subtle, delicate, but unmistakable. And as the first pale thread of dawn finally slips into the world, touching the thatch above with a hint of grey, the hut breathes out in unison, one long, quiet release, as if acknowledging the simple miracle that everyone inside has survived another winter's night. It is not triumph. It is not victory. It is something quieter, older, and infinitely more human. Morning has come. They are alive. And in a world this cold, that is enough.